Good. Okay. Nearly Professor Simon Morley is going to introduce Henrietta. But I really want to, give you a personal welcome and say thanks to all of those who's joined us, and I hope you enjoy the event this evening. Simon.
Thank you, Ken. We'll be having a word with the people who wrote that for you. I think I did not write it, although maybe I should have. Thank you very much, Ken. Thanks for that introduction to the business school, and I want to extend my welcome to Henrietta and, of course, to everyone joining us here this evening. Before I continue Ken's introduction of Henrietta and talk about what brings her here with us today, I just want to say a little bit more about the Health Management Group, because that is where Teddy Chester is most associated with. And as Ken said, next year we celebrate 70 years of what Teddy Chester established. Involved in it to this day. And perhaps in the last 10, 12 years, when we've been running the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson programme and our involvement in the graduate scheme, our conservative estimate is probably we've supported 5,000 to 6,000 NHS staff in terms of their leadership development. Henrietta will also reflect on Teddy Chester's legacy, but I, in my preparation for this, as any good academic would do, went back to the research. And there are two key pieces that I want to kind of talk to you about, which really sum up Teddy Chester. One is a witness seminar from 2019 and a history of the graduate scheme from 2020. So Teddy Chester was fondly remembered by many former trainees as an influential tutor and mentor who was greatly interested in his students before and after they joined the health service. He expected his trainees to be different, to understand the many sensitivities of running a hospital, and he also expected them to make use of new kinds of information that were becoming increasingly available. So performance indicators for costs and returns that you started to see in hospitals in the early 1960s. He was therefore very much a practitioner-focused academic. And he was very clear that the aim of the graduate scheme was to produce managers. And although it offered a diploma for advanced studies in social administration, I should add an advantage over that London-based scheme, it was really about a preparation for management. And if you want to understand the development of thinking about performance and finance in the NHS, and if you want to understand clinical leadership in the NHS, you need to understand that Teddy Chester was all about trying to get doctors and managers and doctors and nurses and doctors and others to sit down and learn each other's language, to live in each other's worlds. But much more than that, for example, he created and maintained strong networks and connections. For example, the Catholic University at Leuven and their first professor of public health, Jan Blampin, he was instrumental in setting up the European Management Association, which we still have an association with today as the European Health Management Association. I want to leave you with one slide, I think, which really sums up his contribution. And this is from an individual who attended that witness seminar back in 2019. What's really nice is that he talks not only about this first-class academic, this sharp analytical mind, and someone who could turn complex concepts into simple and instantly comprehensible information, but actually he was really supportive of the people that he looked after. He was a mentor and a friend, a man of integrity and sincerity. And that's the man that we're celebrating today. As I say, the university's first professor of social administration who joined in 1956. Now, to our Teddy Chester lecturer for 2025. Ken has already told you about some of the things that Henrietta has achieved over her career. Over 30 years as a practicing doctor within the NHS, holding several senior leadership positions, including as the National Guardian for the NHS, where she led efforts to support freedom to speak up, promoting transparency and accountability across healthcare organisations. A medical director for North, Central and East London, and, as Ken mentioned, an OBE in the Queen's New Year Honours lists of 2020. Henrietta continues her clinical practice as a GP in central London and also serves as the chair of Childhood First, a charity dedicated to the care and rehabilitation of children and adolescents. Just up the road from here at the University of Greater Manchester, Henrietta's a visiting professor in their Institute of Medicine, and she also sits as an independent member of the Health Honours Committee and an advisory role on the MedTech Strategy Programme Board. I honestly don't know how she's timed to even come to Manchester this evening. However, we're delighted that as the Patient Safety Commissioner since 2022, her role has been to be an independent voice, acting as a champion for patients, elevating their voices into the heart of government to lead to positive change. It's a drive to improve safety of medicines and medical devices to ensure that patients' voices are at the heart of what all of us do, clinicians, leaders, managers. So on behalf of everyone here, Henrietta, a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you so much. And what an incredibly intimidating introduction. I'm a bit scared of it myself, but it's a huge honor to be with you here this evening. And it's really made me think very hard about what would be useful for you to hear, what would be valuable to take away in your work, in your life, as a patient, maybe, as a healthcare professional, as a senior leader, as a manager. And I wanted to just very briefly reflect on the person that we're really here to celebrate, which is Teddy Chester. Because as well as, his innovative and inspirational work in founding the NHS graduate training scheme and Manchester Business School, I was really interested in the emphasis that he had on that partnership between managers and clinicians. And I remember very well myself going from being quite a competent clinician to an incompetent manager overnight. And that's very often the path that people find themselves. But by working with the non-clinical managers in, first of all, the PCT and the cluster and then NHS England, it really was where the magic came. The combination of the deep expertise and the knowledge of managers working alongside people with a clinical background who could then bring all of that together into that secret sauce. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting was in terms of his background as a Jewish refugee and how much we rely in this country on people working with us from all over the world. And how if we're open our minds to that innovation, that experience, and also that focus on the value of bringing in new ideas, then we're able to overcome all of the problems that we currently face. So as was said, my role came about from First Do No Harm, and it is to promote patient safety, to promote the value of listening to patients, and all of that in relation to medicines and medical devices. And the reason why my role was recommended by Baroness Cumberledge was because patients, mainly women, had been harmed through the use of medicines and medical devices, namely valproate, pelvic mesh, and Primodos. And it was because they hadn't been listened to. They hadn't received the right information to be able to make decisions about their healthcare. And when they were harmed, their voices went unheard, not only by the doctors and nurses looking after them, by their healthcare organizations when they tried to complain, even by officials and by politicians. And so they went out to the press, they found each other through social media, they elevated their voices, and eventually it became a clamor, which led to the Cumberledge Review. And my role is really very much to be that independent champion of the patient voice. And as has been said, I've been a doctor for 30 years, but I've learned more from patients in the previous 3 years in this role than I did in the 30 beforehand as a doctor, because there's a natural reticence about what people will tell you when you're looking after them as a clinician. But as Patient Safety Commissioner, I can absolutely say, no holds barred, I get the unvarnished truth. So my role is a public appointment. I'm not a civil servant. I'm sponsored by the Department of Health and Social Care, and my hosting arrangements are moving to the MHRA, which is the Medicines and Medical Devices Regulator, which is also an agency of the Department of Health. And I think this is important because with the current changes that are happening in the healthcare landscape, the numbers of independent roles is diminishing. And so it's even more important to be that independent voice, to be able to speak up on behalf of patients and the public, to bring thoughts and ideas into the heart of government. And I've put on there my powers. So I have powers of making recommendations and of requesting information. And this evening, what I'll do is talk a little bit about how I've used some of those powers and some of the changes that have come about. But I think it is really important to know that my role is not an executive function, and I have a team of 3 people at the moment. So it's not like I'm able to kind of influence change without influencing it throughout the entire healthcare system. So I thought about what I talked to the medical students about at the University of Greater Manchester in their induction week. And I thought, do I want to say anything drastically different this evening than I would do to students in their first week? And I thought, well, no, not really, actually, because I think there's an awful lot of similarities in terms of what I would like the doctors and the nurses and the healthcare professionals of the future to bring with them into their careers and how they do their work, not just what they do, but how they do it. But also, it's really important for those who are in positions of teaching and training and planning and advising to have that same understanding, because otherwise we end up with these wonderfully knowledgeable students, but they don't have that environment to deploy their knowledge in. So the takeaways that I was really interested in is about how we bring the value of listening to patients and families into all of our work, whether that's in the clinical environment, in policy, strategy, legislation, education. How do we foster a culture of safety throughout all of that? And how do we make sure that we in this room and all of those that we support have the skills and the knowledge that we need for compassionate and holistic healthcare? So I'm going to start with something quite sophisticated, toilet roll. And this came about after I did a visit to a trust where I was discussing with them mainly around pelvic mesh and about the use of devices. But they told me a bit about what they'd been doing on meaningful patient engagement. And I was very interested in the way that they were approaching this. They said that they'd been trying to do patient engagement in the past, but they felt that it was quite tick box. So on the stroke unit, they decided they were going to do a lunch for patients who had been discharged from the ward to bring them back and ask them, what could we do better? You know, you've experienced the treatment that we've had, what could we do better? And they expected to be hearing quite sophisticated, high cost interventions. But one of the patients said, well, in the toilet cubicles, it would be very helpful if you could have a toilet roll on each side, because if you've had a stroke, you've only got a 50-50 chance of being able to reach the toilet paper. Everyone I have told that story to gets it immediately, because the only person who would know that is the patient. That's a ward that has consultants and professors. It's got physios, speech and language therapists, nurse consultants, experts in everything to do with stroke, apart from being inside the cubicle with the patient. And I thought to myself, this is a good example of how we know everything until we realize we don't. And if we create the opportunities to ask patients, what could we do better? They will know so much that would never occur to us, because we come with our own lens. Of course we do, but we just know something. We don't know everything. And last year I published the patient safety principles, part of my legislation, after a public consultation. And we wanted to combine a whole range of different principles that had already been published, including the Nolan principles, in terms of anti-racist principles, thinking about human rights principles, a whole range of different principles, and to bring those together under the umbrella of patient safety. And we've tested these in a wide range of different environments, and they seem to be holding up. we see them as a way to use them as a framework to help make decisions which include the patient's perspective. So to create a culture of safety where we put patients at the heart of everything we do, that we treat people equitably, and we consider health inequalities. We were very keen not to try and wrap that all up into one, that we could identify and act on inequalities, identify and mitigate risks, be transparent and accountable, and use data to drive improved care and outcomes. Well, I think Teddy Chester got to the last one first, actually, in 1956. We've worked with a whole wide range of different organizations, including these organizations on the slide. Circle Healthcare have developed their entire patient safety strategy around the principles. The PSA has included them in their corporate strategy, as has the GMC and the MHRA. The IHPN did an entire summit based on the patient safety principles. But oh, sorry, that's the Independent Healthcare Providers Network. So that's all of the independent sets of hospitals such as Spire, Circle, Nuffield, etc. And what I find is quite interesting is that the independent sector is quick off the mark on this. The NHS is slow, is permission-based, is waiting to be told. You can use the principles. You should use the principles. You must use the principles. And we're hoping that these will go into the NHS Constitution consultation. But we've also worked with Kim Leadbeater MP on the amendments for the assisted dying bill, because we were really keen that patient safety should be woven all the way through that. And we did identify some gaps, including on identifying and acting on risks. So we felt that it was really important that people working in assisted dying would have that opportunity to speak up if they had a concern about the patient's safety or other safety matters. And that was then created as an additional amendment. But if we think about why we need to listen to patients, it's not just the fluffy nice to have. It's very much about outcomes. It's very much about understanding what patients are telling us and then using that for improved outcomes. And I created this infographic based on a paper that was written looking at an online patient feedback system called Care Opinion, which is used for the whole of Scotland. And what the researchers found was that those organizations that had personal, compassionate, and timely feedback that was used for learning and improvement, or as I would describe it, those warm organizations, the patients felt heard, the staff morale was better, and the outcomes were better. And at the cold end of the thermometer, where there was no response, or it was siloed, irrelevant, defensive, in those organizations, the patients didn't feel heard. They went out to the MPs or the press or social media, and the outcomes were worse, and the staff felt disempowered. So by taking that feedback and using it in real time for learning and improvement and making those changes, you get better, you get a win-win in every direction for your patients, for your staff. And I look at this in terms of the relational window. I'm very keen that we move away from the sort of combative and hostile approach that often happens when something's gone wrong. And we work towards a more restorative approach. And we know that, sometimes we do have things done to us, particularly if we're under anesthesia or something like that, or we might have things done for us. But it's much better to have things done with us. And when things go really wrong, it's usually because somebody's in the not part of the relational window. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail later. But the other thing which you may be familiar with is around psychological safety. So Professor Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School talks about the performance zone, where you have high accountability and you have high support. And we need performance. We need that extra productivity, 30% of extra productivity that you can get from staff who are in the high performance zone. But what I find is that if you think about the bottom right-hand corner, which is where there's a lot of accountability and not so much support, is the anxiety zone. And that's where a lot of staff find themselves. And certainly I knew that from my previous job as National Guardian for the NHS, where people didn't feel safe to speak up. They were fearful of what might happen, the consequences of being humiliated, belittled, or victimized. But when I started in this job, and in fact, that was one of the reasons why I was interested in this job, was because the patient said to me, if you think the staff have got it bad, it's an awful lot worse for us. And it's absolutely true that patients often feel very disempowered, and they often feel in that anxiety zone as well. And then the final kind of part of the jigsaw is what's been described as the fourth clinical sign. What matters to you? This is a really important question to ask. Well, I don't just ask it of my patients, actually. I ask it of pretty much everyone that I meet with, because you really get a very different conversation afterwards. Sit with a minister, ask this question. They look up and to the left, which is the place you're thinking. And then I get a different answer. And then we have a completely different conversation. So I would really encourage this conversation, because it gets to the heart of what's important to that person. And then you can find out where your world collides with their world, and where you can then find the win-win. So why does this not happen all the time? Why don't we have these brilliant conversations all the time and find this opportunity to really understand each other? So epistemic injustice is around, really, it's the epistemic, it's about the sort of injustice of knowledge, of that imbalance of knowledge, of status, and of language. And what I think is really interesting in this concept is, this is something I never learned at medical school. I felt it. I felt it as a student, particularly on the wards. You know, you might feel it as a patient. I feel it as a GP sometimes in a room full of physicians or surgeons. But when you can actually put a label on it, a feeling, you can then start interacting and making a difference. So when we think about who's at the top of that ladder, I'm going to say it's the doctors. Okay, you'll be note that I have not put NHS managers on this ladder, because they may be in lots of different places on that ladder. But I think a lot of the time, doctors put themselves right at the very top. I haven't put government ministers on here either, but I would also say doctors put themselves right at the top. And I think why it's important is because when we look at where patients are, they're right at the bottom. And even below the bottom of the ladder are patients who have cognitive or language impairments, people with mental health, with learning disabilities, with language barriers, with dementia. Their voices are so seldom heard. And I would actually put children and young people there as well, because children and young people's voices are seldom heard. And everyone else believes that they are acting as the advocate for those people. It's a kind of does he take sugar type of situation. And we've worked with patients with a vision impairment and hearing impairment, and they often feel that they're below the end of the ladder as well. So here's an example where epistemic injustice was at its worst, where the patient and the family were not listened to at all. This is Martha Mills, who was on holiday with her parents. She was 13. They went for a bike ride. There was some sand on the path in front of her bike, and the front wheel slipped. And the handlebars came all the way around and pushed really deeply into her stomach when she fell off the bike. And at the time, she felt fine. They had a little circle on the skin, but her condition gradually deteriorated. She'd injured her pancreas. It's a recognized complication of this type of accident. She was initially admitted to hospital in Wales, and then she was transferred to a London teaching hospital, which have a lot of expertise in dealing with that type of injury. But over the next few weeks, with her parents at her side, 24 hours a day, Martha herself was raising concerns about her condition. She was saying, could this be sepsis? Her parents were asking the same question. And they were told, no, this is just a routine infection. You know, we'll get the dermatologist to come and see your rash. Even when she started bleeding out of all the ports, she was told, no, we don't need to get anyone to come and see you. We're fine. In fact, her mother said, could we get, you know, an assessment? And she was told, no, we don't want to get a referral to ITU because we think it will make you more anxious. And unfortunately, very sadly, Martha's condition deteriorated even further. And then she went into a coma and never recovered, and very sadly died. And her mother, who is a journalist, wrote about this in The Guardian. And I remember reading it on a Saturday morning. Maybe some of you read it as well. And I was sitting at the kitchen table, and I was absolutely devastated. I was in floods of tears, just thinking, how could this possibly have happened? But I didn't really think about it much after that until I found myself sitting on a sofa in a panel at a conference in California with Martha's mother, because how else would two Brits meet, honestly? And I also, what's been happening? And she was calling for a new policy called Martha's Rule, for a second opinion. And I also, you know, how are you getting on with it? She said, well, no one's really interested. And I was like, that seems so obvious, you know, because other countries in the world have this, in Australia and in America, that if you're concerned about, you know, you're not being listened to, that you could pick up the phone and get someone else to come and see you. So I said to her, let's catch up after the summer. But that summer was when the Lucy Letby verdict was reached. And the Secretary of State at the time, Steve Barclay, asked me and others, what are the policy areas that we should be looking at? And I said, well, I think Martha's Rule. You know, you have to come up with three. One of them was Martha's Rule. And a few days later, Merope was interviewed on the Today programme and talked at length about Martha and about Martha's Rule. And so the Secretary of State, when he was asked about it in the House of Commons, knew about it and said, we're going to look into that. And he asked me to develop the policy to make Martha's Rule a success in England, using the policy sprint development. And I have to say, I left the room having said, I would love to do that. And I rang my husband and I said, what is policy sprint development? And he said, oh, it's all about Spotify and cutting code. I was like, none the wiser. But I learned how to do this in very few days. And fortunately, I did not have any preconceived notion that policy development took 18 months, because 18 days later, my recommendations were with the Secretary of State. But I didn't do this on my own. This was a very collaborative and very inclusive approach with the family and their representatives at the centre, with patient groups, with providers, with Royal Colleges, and with the regulators. CQC, NMC, and GMC did a joint statement. We had people from societies, experts in all different ways, and NHS resolution, it was fantastic. They said to all the law firms, do not litigate, because you will destroy this if you start litigating, because patients don't get access to a rapid review. And so they didn't. But I developed the very basic policy, which was about a structured approach to listening, asking a patient in hospital every day, at least once, how are you feeling? Do you feel well? Do you feel ill? Do you feel better or worse than the last time you were asked? And as a GP, I have to say, I was quite surprised that that wasn't quite standard, but it wasn't being used in a structured way. And you could anticipate a deterioration in the news score by 24 to 48 hours. The second element was having a 24 escalation route to critical care outreach for all staff, even if the news score was normal. And then the final one, and this was the really exciting bit, was that the patients and families would have access to that same phone number. So with over 5,000 calls in the first 9 months and more than 250 patients having their care escalated to intensive care or back to theatre or interventional radiology or to a tertiary centre, and hundreds of others having changes in their management, or recognizing other aspects which weren't about deterioration, like the timing of the medicines administration, I would say that this is safer for patients. It's safer for staff because you're less likely to get a complaint. You are less likely to have an incident. You're less likely to be dealing with a deterioration in your patient. And I would see this as safer for all. But one of the things which I found was really interesting talking to a medical examiner was that they said to me, the same themes that bereaved families want to talk to us about are what people ring us about in terms of Martha's Rule. And I would contend it's better to have those conversations while the patient is still alive. So that formed a part of the strategy that I set out for the first 3 years. We were ambitious, as I said, not a big team, but big ambitions, to have an alignment of the healthcare culture with the patient voice in their own care, but in the design and delivery of healthcare as well, and working with global partners. And since Martha's Rule pilot has been extended now to the whole of England, all acute trusts, it's also being started in Switzerland and in the Netherlands. And we're getting interest from other parts of the world as well. So I do think that you can take a single patient voice, you can amplify that into the heart of government, and then start seeing global change happening as a result. But I mentioned before about working with patients with sensory impairment, with visual impairment, and also with hearing impairment. We reckon there's 2 million people in this country with visual impairment and sight loss, 18 million with hearing loss, tinnitus, and deafness. There's not a small group, but it was a group of people who really were not getting the traction to be able to see things through the safety lens. And this is where our report looked at the safety and accessibility of medicines and medical devices with a deep dive into diabetes and vision loss, because people with diabetes are more likely to lose their vision, but also be using medicines and medical devices on a daily basis. And you can see in the image this glucometer. I think it was designed in the 1980s. It's got this very sleek, monochrome, sort of black, very difficult to see the parts if you've got a visual impairment. But also, I think this quote from a patient about their own experience, about the fact that it was degrading when their prescription was changed and they weren't able to use a self-injecting device. We made recommendations to the MHRA, to NHS England, and this is about licensing and packaging, making sure that it's inclusive. The NHS app, which is going to be the front door to the NHS, but is not accessible for people with visual impairment. But also about the patient information leaflet. You know, when you get your box of pills and inside there's a leaflet that only 1 in 10 people actually ever read. But if you unwrapped it, it would probably cover that screen there. They're very flimsy, impossible to read. But what I'm really excited about, we made a recommendation to restart the electronic patient information leaflet work so that the information about medicines is going to be digitized, it's going to be accessible, and it's going to be ready for patients to read before they go and pick up their prescription. And I know as a GP, it's not unusual for people to come back and say, I'm sorry, doctor, I'm intolerant to lactose. And I had no idea that this medicine was going to be a problem for the patient. But it's about that partnership working. It's about seeing patients as part of the clinical team. And more recently, last month, a new national commission into the regulation of AI in healthcare was launched. And I'm very excited to be the deputy chair of that commission, but also chairing a working group of the system. And I think if you look at that slide that I had from Martha's Rule with so many different partners in it, you'll see how important it is that we get views from a wide range of different perspectives in order to create the principles for regulating something which is changing fast and also in an unpredictable way, and making sure that our regulations don't then become out of date the day they get published. I'm already using AI in my clinical practice. I use ambient voice recording. It listens in, it produces a beautiful record. I show the patient, they like to see their voice is seen as important by the AI as mine. They see their words in the clinical record, and there are lots of real positives because I'm not typing away while I'm talking to them or hearing what they're saying. But there are some constraints as well. The AI doesn't code. It gets things wrong. And you need to have more than a human in the loop. You need to have an expert in the loop or on the loop, depending on how you're using the AI, so that we make sure that that accountability is in place. There are lots of unanswered questions around liability, around training, around making sure that we've got transparency of the algorithm. In some countries, they publish all algorithms that are used for the public good. So we're learning from people from different countries who've got experience of using AI in healthcare. We're learning from the wide range of different experiences and certainly listening to what patients will tolerate in terms of inaccuracy. So a human might get it wrong 5 in 100. The machine might get it wrong 1 in 100. But people might be less tolerant of the machine getting it wrong at all. I think this is a real watch this space type of area. So going back into where I started, think about what are the barriers? What are the barriers? What I'm describing is so obvious. When we published the principles, somebody said they're too simple. And I said, thank you. Because Mark Twain said, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I've written you a long letter. Simplicity is often the hardest thing to get. And doing the right thing, making the right thing the easiest thing to do is often the hardest thing to do, because we don't have a health system which is currently designed around patients. The 10-year health plan talks about the centrality of the patient voice. I'm still interested in what that's actually going to look like. I thought that the design of the 10-year health plan was a fantastic, intentional, deliberative listening events. The hard bit is going to be then translating that into everyday business as usual. Fostering a culture of safety. How are we going to do that when we have pressures around finance, around productivity? And safety doesn't even get into the planning guidance unless I write stern letters to the Chief Exec of NHS England. And then the skills and knowledge for compassionate, holistic healthcare. The ethos of the medical school in the other place, Greater Manchester, is around compassionate, holistic healthcare. How do we instill that not only into the students, but how do we instill that into all of those who are treating, who are teaching, who in the clinical placements, that they're not going to just immediately lose all that wonderful stuff they've learned in the lecture theatre? Maybe you can tell me when it comes to the questions. Well, I think there are 3 things that are needed. And I think the first one is about leadership. And I'm in a room surrounded by leaders, and the leaders online. You're here, you've turned up, you turn up every day. And I see leadership is unbelievably important, not only in terms of the leadership of the people who are providing the healthcare, but also who are the patients and those families, the ones who are supporting and receiving the healthcare as well. And the more that we're able to see everybody as part of that one team, the better. The listening aspect, I call this talk listening to patients, but listening is obviously a really important part. But in my previous role, I coined the expression speak up, listen up, follow up. Because the listening is great. People say, oh, I listened. I was like, and? So I mentioned before about my powers. One of the powers that I have is about requesting information. And I've been waiting for 2 years now to get a response from the government to the recommendations I made on the redress for patients who've been harmed through medicines and medical devices. And I've listened to the patients and their representatives from both houses of parliament. And listening is really important. I've put it here, but it's what you then do. It's what you then do. And that's where I come on to the partnership. So I wrote to the minister on Friday to mark the 2-year anniversary, requesting information using the powers that I have in the Act. And the patients were, if I put deliriously happy, I think it's probably underestimating it, because they saw that it's not just about listening. It's about doing something. It's about taking on board their needs and then escalating those to the people who have the power, the authority, and the accountability to do it. I would say that the transparency and accountability are the bits that are very often missing in our healthcare system. I've included them in the patient safety principles because people will say, we learned. I'll say, oh, that's nice. And then what happened? We learned. And then what happened? Yeah, we've heard it all and we've learned. I'm like, but have you changed something? Has anybody had any kind of consequence of creating the system in the first place that didn't work? And I think accountability goes upwards. Support should be going downwards and accountability should always be going upwards. So I think leadership, listening and partnership, I'm not going to say they're in short supply, but it's not consistent and we need more of all of them. I've got a QR code that goes to our website, but I know we've also had the Menti code on all of these slides. So I do hope that I will be getting some questions that will challenge me, because that's how I will learn and improve. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you. It's challenged me to think about what will be the takeaways, and I'm really excited to see what will be the consequences of me being here this evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Henrietta, and thank you for doing my job, which I should have done at the start, which is to point out that there is a Mentimeter running. So we'll take some questions. We've had some come in already, so well done to the eagle-eyed people who have picked that up. But it is menti.com and the code 82757732. So whilst the online audience is warming up, or the audience in the room who don't want to speak, do we have any questions in the room? Do we? I think we have some roving mics, do we? Or Sheen? And okay, we've got a question on this side down at the front first. So apologies if I don't get to everyone, but now the questions are coming in really fast. It's just this lady here.
Henrietta, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm an 80-year-old lady, and when I was a young lady, I had two daughters. One was born in 1962 and one was born in 1963. What happened was we were given x-rays when we were pregnant, and that our whole life has been a disaster. My eldest daughter actually suffered with severe mental health problems and actually committed suicide in 2006. My other daughter now was born in 1963, suffers for dreadful, dreadful physical problems. Although she's got a degree and she's got a family and everything, she suffers from, how can I say it, psoriasis, deafness, and we were given. I'm sorry, I'm quite emotional. We were given X-rays in the 60s, and this is the legacy now that's happened to our family, because of we sort of thought outright everybody's great, the hospitals, they know what they're doing, and this is what happened to my family. And I just, my niece said, your daughter's really, really ill. She's been actually stopped from work. She's got no job and everything. And she suffers from these health problems because of 1960, giving people x-rays when they were pregnant. Maybe Henrietta can maybe help me with that one.
Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry about your experience. And, I've spoken and heard from patients, and I would say mothers who have had all sorts of interventions where there hasn't been a consideration of where there's harm, but also when there's a known harm, there hasn't been a program to have that opportunity to listen and then to respond. And I think from my perspective, I was thinking very much about how we build trust. And, trust is something which, arrives on foot and leaves on horseback, essentially. And it's not always about necessarily knowing everything in advance or getting everything right, but it's about taking the personal responsibility and taking the accountability for when things have gone wrong. But I also think that there's something about that believing. A lot of patients and have told me that when they have raised things, that the system has just shut the doors and said, it's all in your head, it's all in your mind, we don't believe you. And that women have been treated as guinea pigs in the health system. So I'm so sorry about your experience. I'm so sorry about the impact that it's had on your family. And, I can only say that this is such a familiar, tragic pattern of an account that I've heard, whether that's around mesh, valproate, Primodos, and a whole host of others. You know, it's like an ongoing kind of a continuum of issues that get raised in my office. What I am able to say is that we chip away at the fortress. You know, we chip away at the fortress and start seeing positive changes by bringing together the voices of patients, politicians, and the press is the most effective in my experience. But it's also about thinking about who's responsible, what are their obligations, who's been harmed, what do they need, you know, what can we learn and what do we do differently in the future? And that is the pillars of restorative practice. So in some ways, we've seen this change happening. NHS Resolution have totally rewritten their strategy, and they're looking for a restorative approach, like the relational window that I showed around working with people, trying to get away from turning things into a legal issue, thinking about listening, thinking about the needs of individuals, but also thinking about how we can not just learn from what happened in the past, but use that information so that we don't find ourselves in that situation again.
Thank you, Henrietta. That's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We've got 8 questions. I will come to you, Lawrence. I just want to take one from online because it kind of relates to that a little bit, which is someone's asked, the NHS has been running for more than half a century. I think we're up to 3/4 of a century, aren't we, almost? Over this period, there are very few areas that provide protections for the patient. With all repeat errors, when will we have legislation?
Well, I think this is where I'm very interested in the other, I would say other, but high safety industries have safety management systems or quality management systems. And that's about understanding the risks and then putting the mitigations in. Physical forcing functions that prevent you from doing the wrong thing. If you think about it, if you've got a petrol car or a diesel car, it's designed to really make it difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to refuel your car with the wrong fuel. But in healthcare, we don't put those systems into place. We rely on, you know, people doing the right thing. And even today, I was writing about boxes of medicines where manufacturers can exchange the barcodes, reuse barcodes. It's like a bit scary, isn't it? Because you think, but if someone's scanning the barcode and that has now been changed, has it updated in all the systems, you know? So we need to have much more rigorous enforcement of standards, but also that feeds into clinical practice. I'm really interested in when we have a safety alert that comes from the regulator, why people don't change their practice. And it's not about training people and it's not about reminding people. It's about making it very difficult to do the wrong thing by making changes in the electronic patient record or in the prescribing process, by about having audit and making sure that everybody's informed. But it's a total conundrum. And if you go to other countries, health systems, some of them in the independent sector, they have a system whereby you have to follow all of these rules as if you were working in Shell or BP. You know, in Shell or BP, I heard yesterday that if you were staying in a hotel room, you'd be expected to count how many doors you were away from the stairwell. And that's what you did before you went to bed at night. Because if there was smoke, you would get down on your hands and knees under the smoke, you would count how many doors, and then you'd know how to exit the property. That's because if you were then on an oil rig, you would follow all the safety rules. You would hold the handrail. You would reverse your car into the parking space. Could you imagine us doing that in the health system and expecting all the staff to follow those rules day in, day out? Well, that's the culture that we need, the culture of safety. But then you end up with a situation where people want to have, you know, I'm an independent practitioner, this is how I want to do it. So in some ways, if we were able to bring that culture of a high reliability organization in, we're going to radically reduce the number of errors. It was estimated that there's 143 million medication errors that happen every year in the health system. My ambition is to bring that down to no more than 14 million.
Well, we might come back to some of that in a bit. So we've got lots of questions, but we'll come to Lawrence here at the front.
I really enjoyed your presentation, but I'm retired now. But it really was a case of deja vu to me, really. So I think all the messages you've put across, I've seen from various administrations, political and within that, people actually running the health service. I think on the positive side, there's day in, day out, there's millions of very dedicated staff who do an amazing job and do listen to patients. But, you know, I take your point that we have to reduce this down as far as we can. And as somebody with a long-term mental health problem, I feel quite empowered by AI because you mentioned the asymmetry on knowledge between the person. I don't like the word patient with mental health. That comes very much from an acute medical view on the world. And all I want is to have a 5-minute discussion with a psychiatrist on the links between bipolar disorder and dementia. So I can find all the evidence very quickly, and a layperson could do this on AI. But actually trying to access the specialist to have a 5-minute discussion, which might save the NHS a lot of money, is incredibly difficult. So I'd welcome your views on that.
I completely agree with you about potential for AI to really remove some of those imbalances in the epistemic injustice, because there's something about coming with all of the information and also the information that matters to you. It's not just the information that matters to the healthcare professional. And I even came across a very well-known patient safety campaigner in the States who had a Bell's palsy. She went to one hospital, they sent her away. She looked it up on ChatGPT and it said, you might have a Bell's palsy. If you start steroids within 48 hours, it can make a massive difference. She turned up to another hospital with that information and they put her on steroids. And so there's something about that sort of ability to turn up and have that conversation, which is a much more equal, a conversation of equals. And I think it's not going to work for everybody, because some people don't want to have that conversation of equals. Some people want to turn up and be told. But I think the other aspect about that is around the access part. So it may be in the future that you wouldn't have that 5-minute conversation with the psychiatrist. You'd have the conversation with the chatbot, and it would then identify which patients would need to go forward and actually speak to a human. So we know that there are robotic assessment for physiotherapy. FIO is one of those. For patients with a cataract in the south of England, all their pre and post-op appointments are being done using a chatbot. We know that there's real opportunities there. For some patients, they prefer it. They get better empathy from the chatbot. But in other situations, you're going to need to then have a conversation that won't be done through a chatbot. But we know that we've got real problems with access. So maybe part of this is about separating out and triaging, so that we can then say, if you need to have that 5-minute conversation, the time is freed up because the psychiatrist is using ambient voice recording and they're not spending 20 minutes out of every 60 typing up their notes. So I think we're on the cusp of a revolution. I think it's a really interesting time. I think there's pros and there's cons, but I also have concerns, particularly about children and young people using chatbots, you know, in terms of their mental health, because I think we don't have the guardrails in place. And because those things like ChatGPT, etc., are not designed for the intention of being a medical device, they escape regulation at the moment. So it's a fascinating moment in time, and we'll look back in maybe 2 years or 3 years and think, well, the AI then was rubbish and now it's amazing. I think it's probably the worst it will ever be. But we need to make it really bespoke to individual patients. What works for one person, I've had some patients saying, I didn't come here to talk to a robot. I don't want to have the computer listening in. And I think that's a very valid point.
I mean, paradoxically, the system at the moment is based on risk. So the access to the psychiatrist, in my case, if I'm a non-urgent case, means that it's extremely difficult to have a private conversation. Might save the NHS a lot of money.
So can I just pick up online the questions coming which relates to this, which is, given the rapid growth of digital apps, talk about the NHS app, how is MHRA approaching the oversight of mental health apps and other things like that use AI or behavioural data? Because there's this thing, isn't there, about, and that sounds like a very risk-averse position, but in fact, if that isn't thought about now, in 3 years' time, we could be in a completely different place. So what are, I mean, you just said, you know, some of this stuff is outside of the remit of MHRA, but if it's got a link to health, what's their role in that?
So the first thing to say is the plane is already in flight.
Yeah.
There are apps, there are devices that are using artificial intelligence, mainly for diagnosis, for early disease detection, but also in these other ways as well. And this is the purpose of the commission. The purpose of the commission is to get an understanding of all of these things. What is in scope? What is not in scope? Because, you know, a class, I mean, sorry, I sound a bit geeky here, but a class 1 medical device is something like a bandage. But the regulations were last updated in 2002, when a medical device was something which was a sort of physical object that probably wouldn't change over time.
With a plug socket.
or a bandage or a hip joint. We weren't expecting devices to be things which were going to be modified or to change themselves, or really for us not to even understand how they work. And that's where the value of having a wide range of inputs, to be able to give advice to the MHRA, to look at the principles of regulation. There's a very famous bridge in Honduras, the Choluteca Bridge. I probably mispronounced it. It was in an area where they knew they had really strong storms. And so the Japanese designed a bridge that would withstand the strongest storm that there had ever been. And it did, but the river moved. So we got to think about not creating something like that bridge, which is brilliant and pointless all at the same time. I'm thinking more about the bridge in San Diego. In San Diego, in Southern California, they know they have earthquakes. They also have their largest naval base. And so you have to have a bridge that will break, but would not obstruct the harbor. And so it's designed to break and float. And then a tug will come and tow the parts away and then put them all back together again afterwards. And I think that the regulations that the MHRA will need to have in the future for devices that are going to be changing, that will break, that will potentially have escape, we don't know. There has to be flexibility. It has to be exponential flexibility to deal with an exponential and unknown change in devices that are being regulated.
Yeah, there's some great examples, aren't there, of other industries that are kind of futuristing the issues. We've got lots of questions here. Just remember, you've got menti.com, and if you want to help, you know, overcome my bias for choosing the questions, you can upvote questions if you want, and I am trying to be good like that. But we do have at least 2 more questions in the room, so we'll come to Naomi.
Naomi Chambers, Professor of Healthcare Management. I'm particularly focused, Henrietta, on variation in the quality of leadership in the NHS. And you have, in my view, quite rightly signalled that leadership is a very important enabler of being able to listen and also take action to patient about what patients say. I'm just interested in your comments on that variation. Just to give an example for people, you can see that in terms of the National Staff Survey results, there are some organisations not far from here where staff do not consider the place that they work is somewhere that they would recommend for, you know, their family and friends to be treated and or for, you know, to work. And then there are other places which are considered, ranked much more highly. What can we do about this very persistent variation in the quality of leadership across the NHS, which we know there is evidence that then impacts on patient experience and patient outcomes?
So I'm going to go back to my old job because in my old job, I was really interested in why some organizations, the staff survey, and I love the staff survey. I mean, for me, it's the desert island data for understanding. And we know that the staff survey data is also linked to patient outcome data. So there's also something really important about the patient experience team being really interested in the staff survey. So we looked at what the staff said about the speak up culture in those organizations. And we pulled together 4 questions and we turned that into a single number, the Freedom to Speak Up Index, suggested by Simon Stevens. He said, look, these are the 4 questions that really matter. We turned that into a single number. And then we looked to see who had the highest scores. And we looked at overall and different sectors, so specialist. And this is the order in which, you know, the groups of trusts sort of ranked. Specialist trusts had the highest speak up culture, followed by mental health, learning disability, community trusts, followed by acute, followed by ambulance. And we looked at the, you know, the sort of leaders in the field of each of those. And then I rang up their chief execs and I said, congratulations, you've won a prize for a contest you didn't even know you'd entered. What do you do? And we interviewed them and their Freedom to Speak Up guardians. And of course, those organizations that were brilliant thought they were normal. They thought they weren't that brilliant, actually. But I learned so much from the themes that came out from all of these different types of organizations, people that didn't know each other. And that's another thing which I think is a really big problem, is that people just don't know each other. It's really difficult to introduce people continuously so that people can learn from successes elsewhere. But there were 3 things that they said made all the difference. And they're not very expensive things. It's not about having a specialist trust and having a new building and everything else. The 3 things that made the difference were visible leadership, communication, and engagement. So visible leadership, and there was a trust that I went to where they had a board. I visited about 150 trusts in my old job, and that was amazing because I just got to see so many amazing things and terrible things too. But what they did in one trust was they had in the executive corridor a whiteboard, and it had the name of all of the wards and departments on the x-axis, and it had the names of all of the execs on the y. And there was an expectation that every month everyone would go everywhere and they had to sign the board when they'd been there. And I said, well, if you really want to go for it, take a photo and put that on your social media every month, you know, because you're saying to your staff, we actually are interested. So that visible leadership is so important. The second thing about communication, tell people what's going on. So I'm a GP. Somebody is in their pre-contemplative part of their thinking about stopping smoking, for example. And I say, so when are you going to stop? They're not ready. But if I say to them, have you ever thought about stopping smoking? If you ever think about stopping smoking, why don't you come back and see me and we can have a conversation? They're pre-contemplative. You need to move them to contemplative and then on to into action. And what often happens, I think, in lots of organizations, not just in healthcare, is that you get a small group of people who go from pre-contemplative to contemplative to action. And then they launch their brilliant idea onto the unsuspecting staff who are still pre-contemplative. And then you get an abreaction. So I would absolutely say, have those conversations in real time with your staff. Say, look, we're thinking about this, or we're planning that. What do you think? And get that feedback in from your patients. And that's the other bit, that's engagement. It's not a one-way flow. It's not just this chief exec's Twitter account. This is about having that opportunity for learning and listening and getting that information back. Like on the safety thermometer slide I showed you before. It's that engagement and that action from that, which is the most important. I had some chief execs who said to me, well, I mean, freedom to speak up is the only way that I can know what to put into our strategy. And you had others who said, we haven't had any cases, isn't that great? So I know where I'd rather work. But I don't think, you know, even putting it into everything, which I will attribute to Mark, because Mark Britnell said to me, put it everywhere. Put it in the contract, put it in the inspection, put it into the leadership, and put it in, and I did, because of course if Mark says put it in everywhere, put it in everywhere. But you know, even with it so embedded across the whole health system and into the independent sector, you still have people who just completely pay lip service to it. So I think that's, to me, is if anyone had the answer to that, please share it with all other sectors, because every other sector has the same problem. But that is about us tolerating leaders that I wouldn't give, you know, airtime to personally.
Thank you, Henrietta. We have had a rush of questions in the room and elsewhere, so I'm going to be a bit stricter now, both with the questioners and with Henrietta.
I talk too much.
No, I'm just saying we're going to get a bit of rapid response now. We've got a gentleman right at the back. I think he's had his hand up for quite some time. Is he still looking to ask that question, sir? You are? Yeah, please do. Go ahead.
So I'm Adam Larder. My father's a GP as well in Manchester. And my question is, so the NHS waiting lists right now are incredibly long. And how big of a safety issue is those incredibly long waiting lists?
That's a great question. I'm going to split that into two halves. I'm going to get into trouble, but I am. The first one is, how do we know who is unsafe to be on a waiting list, and how do we find them? And I did a piece of work when I was at NHS England, or actually, yeah, there was some, like 1 million unverified pathways in one trust in London. And so they had a whole load of people on their waiting list. They had no idea who they were or what the risks were. And because of that, they were able to, we had a group that met every month for 4 years, I think. And at the end of that, we were able to say, look, if you're going to have people on your waiting list, don't stratify them by length of time on the list, stratify them by risk. So if someone's got an aortic aneurysm, it doesn't matter if they've been on it for 1 month or 1 year. It all matters about the size of that aneurysm and the likelihood of it actually, you know, bursting while they're waiting for surgery. So you can actually look at risk stratification of patients on your waiting list. The other thing about it is in terms of how unsafe it is to have people on your waiting list. I would say it is if you don't do anything with them. So I'm a great believer in prehabilitation, which is apparently people don't even believe is a real word. I think it is a real word. And it's about how you get people into the best possible shape for the procedure that they're going to have. And I know not everyone on the waiting list is waiting for a procedure. A lot of people, a huge number, are waiting for an outpatient appointment and a diagnosis. But if we do have people waiting for an orthopedic procedure or a surgical procedure, then I'm really keen that we invest in that time that somebody's on the waiting list to help them with lifestyle, weight loss, stopping smoking, improving their activities. But most importantly is to ask that question, what matters to you? Because it's a well-known secret that people get put onto waiting lists with procedures that are going to be no benefit for them, or actually even worse than that. So if we use that opportunity to revisit, and it's not a sort of 3 strikes and you're off the waiting list, it's more about having a really bespoke conversation and saying, what matters to you, and understanding what it is that the patient needs and they want, and then saying, is this the right procedure? Have we discussed the benefits, the risks, the alternatives, and options of doing nothing? So in my sort of way of looking at the opportunities and the risks of the waiting list, that is the way that I would approach it.
Thank you for the question. I will come to you in a minute, sir. So it's just in front of you there. But online, I want to give you a question that's been upvoted. Do you think there's an elephant in the room in relation to workloads of NHS staff, which sometimes make it difficult for them to have the time to listen to patients?
Oh, 100%. 100%. I mean,
so what do we do about NHS workloads? There's a worldwide shortage, marks in the room, of healthcare professionals.
Well, I mean, I think this is where I would see it as working in partnership with patients. Because if we believe that primary care is when someone comes to see their GP, I would actually say that that's incorrect. Primary care is when somebody has a headache and they go to their bathroom cabinet and get a paracetamol. Mm-hmm. You know, people are, you know, able to do more for themselves if we give people the information and the tools and the skills and the confidence to do that. And then there's something about how we bring technology to people so that we can identify things early and get that swift access that was mentioned earlier as a problem. But when I think about some of the problems that come to me in the practice, these are societal ills. And healthcare is seen as maybe the universal fix for that. But it's also a place where a member of the public can see a professional without paying a fee. So the type of range of issues that people have brought to me in the practice have been quite interesting, about investing in property or about family problems, about all sorts of things. And I really love the definition of general practice, which is anything your patient wants to discuss with their GP. But there's also a point where we can't just expect health to be the funnel through which, you know, poor housing quality, you know, poor air quality, lack of access to education, lack of access to work, you know, societal ills in every type are then seen as you can fix it in the GP, you can fix it in the health system. I think we have to really sort of work much more collaboratively with other parts of the government to really understand how we can build that that skills knowledge up so that people then become more active partners in their own care.
Thank you. We've got a gentleman, I think, here with the glasses.
Thanks very much. As John Sainsbury, I'm the Innovation Manager at Greater Manchester Mental Health Trust. And I'm also working alongside the Patient Safety Research Centre in GM, currently looking at psychological safety. And you've touched upon it earlier, and we know, as Google found, it's the main moderator of success in teams. However, the evidence is very poor for implementing interventions which support psychological safety in healthcare. What would you recommend, you know, for practitioners, for leaders, for researchers, the factors that would enhance psychological safety? Where should we start?
Well, I think you have to start with people's personalities, you know, and that's where it gets quite tricky, because if you look at anesthesia, for example, you know, they incorporate mistakes into their simulation training, because I think anaesthetists, you know, are keen to work in a safe environment in that way. And I work very closely with the Royal College of Anaesthetists and also the Association of Anaesthetists. And in terms of developing that safety management system, thinking about safety upfront, and, you know, being with like-minded people who are also having that same expectation. The difference is that with anesthesia, you're usually looking after one patient at a time. And I think that makes it very different from managing a caseload. And the other aspect to say is that, you know, when you look at how they were able across the world to come together, the International Association of Anaesthetists, so that every crash trolley in the world is set up the same. You know, let's learn from people who just do this brilliantly, you know, because in other parts, it's going to be more complex. You know, if you look at ED or if you look at if you look in theatres, etc. But I would absolutely say let's start with the people who are really good at this. The other thing which I think is really important is about civility and the overlay between civility and psychological safety. So the campaign Civility Saves Lives has a host of information in it and the evidence base. But we know that civility is something which frays, it wears really thin when people are tired or hungry, angry, late. So there's something about creating the conditions where people can flourish, but there's also something about not tolerating incivility in the workplace. I think if you start with incivility, you're more likely to end up with psychological safety. But I also think that there's something about understanding what sits behind incivility. I think a lot of it is learned behaviors and people who've been able to, you know, get away with it for a long time. I hope that's helpful. And I'd be really interested to get feedback of whether it's actually effective as well.
Thank you, Henrietta. We've got a few more questions, a couple more online and one more in the room. So I want to ask this one and ask for a quick response because it's a really simple answer, I'm sure. How does the financial system for the management of the NHS need to be adjusted to support more partnership with patients?
Right, so I'm going to go back to what the leaders in the field of freedom to speak up said. Because what they said was, if you start with the money, things go horribly wrong. But if you start with the culture, then safety follows, and then the money follows. Now, some people don't really like the word culture. They find it difficult to define. I've worked in lots of different places, some of which have been very warm and inviting, but also high accountability cultures. And I've worked in others which are quite the opposite. And I think that the more that we actually focus on the safety culture, which is why I put it at the top of the principles, we will then start seeing those safety dividends and then the financial. So when people talk about the financial dividends of having electronic patient records, the chief technologist of the NHS has said to me, the financial dividend comes from the safety dividend. So we start with the culture, the finances, then the safety follows, and then the finance follows.
Thank you for that. We're going to go to this question in the room, and then we're going to come back online. So.
Hi, Henrietta. Mark Britnell, Chair of Health Innovation Manchester. I think it's great the Patient Safety Commissioner is coming up to Manchester and giving the Teddy Chester lecture. He was a pioneer in better management, and thanks for telling us of your success and your team's success. What captured my mind was your team is very small, and in an environment now where we're told that the sky will fall on our head through the bureaucracies of NHS England and the Department of Health coming together, is your success being a small team that's nimble, that connects and leads in a fundamentally different way to the way that we're managed today? And will you be applying for the next Chief Executive of the Care Quality Commission?
So
you can choose whether you want to answer
first
any of them.
question. So I've thought about this because I thought I had quite a sort of small team in my old job, but in my current role, it's really, I would say, quite challenging. But the hidden genius that created the funding arrangements for my role clearly realized that it was going to be impossible for me to have any impact if I just spent time with my own people. And the only way for me to succeed was to be forced to lead with and through others. And so not having people in my direct line management has never been the big issue for me. It's finding willing volunteers who get excited about the potential for being able to live their values and be able to deliver on the things that really matter to them. And I think Martha's Rule is a fantastic case in point. We faced a huge amount of opposition from various quarters, and now people are saying, I thought this was going to be really bad, but now I think it's really good. And so, you know, finding the people that you work with as a community of practice around a common enterprise is definitely the right way, and I don't have to be their boss to make that happen.
Thank you, Henrietta. You could, the CQC question, you can leave till later. Well, one more question from a gentleman in the room, and then we'll go to the final question online.
Fantastic, thank you. Just want to say, firstly, thank you for coming and actually engaging. I actually find it really interesting. When I speak to patients, there's two key points I'd just quickly like to raise. The first one is related to the Consumer Policy Act and how we define what a medical device is. And the questions related to patient redress and the link to the long stop 10-year rule, for example, being that if you purchase a washing machine, you have the same a time to actually put redress back across if you have a medical device placed into your body. And that's the first point. And the second point is related to explanted materials. So estimates say around 95% of explanted materials that are thrown in the bin. Coming from experience, it's more like 99%. So my question really is, how can we get engagement from clinicians who would be willing to support the service to actually look at explanted materials? I think it was actually quite interesting. You actually put up earlier about the importance of data. We're throwing away a considerable amount of data there, which can be used to not just refine new medical devices, but also help us understand what's going on with the ones that have not been very successful. So those 2 points really.
So when it comes to sort of what is a medical device and, you know, how is it being defined, etc., I think that is it's part of the reason why the regulations are being updated. The regulations were right for their time, but they're not right for now. We know that there are what is described as homebrew. So, you know, if you're a hospital, you can create a device. It doesn't have to go to the regulator. There are other devices which aren't designed for the intention of being used as a medical device, and they can escape regulation. And I think there's something about really sort of working with the real world in terms of looking at the context. I think when it comes to redress and the point about the long stop, this is something where there are a whole, I mean, you saw that very busy slide I put up with my strategy, and there were a whole bunch of things there from the Cumberledge Review, which never got dealt with. There was no Cumberledge task force to take those recommendations and actually turn them into action. So I sort of did that myself, basically, because I thought, well, look, these were important topics. And some of those relate to, you know, the environment that creates the safety or the safety culture to be able to do things. So if we take something like mesh, a lot of the side effects were late side effects, and they fell outside the product liability situation, which is why I felt that it was the entire system that had failed the patients. It wasn't about just a doctor or a hospital or a regulator. It was a combination of holes in the Swiss cheese all the way through that left the patients stranded. And that's why I believe that there was an injustice, and that's why the patients should be entitled to redress, a two-stage scheme. And the first one was for the injustice that they had suffered. But I also think the other aspect about this is about saying, how are we then learning? So we now have the Outcomes and Registries program, where the registry is bringing together multiple registries, and we're going to have 2.4 million devices on there every year. So we're going to be able to then interrogate that data. The data that we had for mesh was so patchy that you can't actually draw any conclusions from it. The way the systems were designed was for billing, because we bought them from America. And that doesn't work when it comes to looking at patient harm. The yellow card system, I mean, I go into a room with senior leaders and I say to them, do you know that yellow cards can be used for medicines? And most hands go up. I ask the same question about devices, and not a single hand goes up, because there's been no communication to the workforce to say you can use a yellow card for devices. Oh, sorry, you get me on a, I'm going on too long. Right, so what I would say is, for us to be able to create this safety management system, there are a whole load of other government departments that also have to get their ducts in a line to make it safe for patients.
So, sorry, there is one question that's been upvoted the most, so I want to end with it. I'm going to ask you for a really quick response to it before Ken comes to close the event, which is, given everything you've discovered over the past 3 years about patient safety, where does the system need to be in the next 3?
Well, I have less than 36 months left in this post. I can,
a year and a half.
So I've got, no, I've appointed for a second term. But I cannot be appointed for any more. So there's nothing like having a deadline to sort of focus the mind. And I've been thinking very much about how to find the doors that are slightly ajar, because it's a lot easier to push on those. And I think that the 10-year health plan has got to be the vehicle that we are able to then move things forward using the 3 shifts. The shift of an analog to digital, I think AI, the app, technology, these are all going to be in my wheelhouse. The next one is about prevention. So the shift from sickness to prevention. And I asked the Secretary of State about this and said, does that include prevention of harm? He gave a little speech and then he said yes. So I take that as a mandate. And then the final one is about care closer to home, hospital to community. Now, some people could interpret that as, well, we used to see you in a hospital clinic room, but now we see you with the same doctor and the same nurse, you know, in another room, which is near your house. I'm going to say, let's be a bit more bold than that. Let's talk about care closer to home, because I see patients online in their home. I triage patients who filled in a form at home. They don't come anywhere near the practice. So if we actually thought about what it is that people want, and then we design systems that work for them, then I think we're going to be in a good place. How much we can change in 3 years all depends on how much people are prepared to give up their power and work with patients as partners.
Thank you.
So I really want to thank Henrietta and Simon for a really informative, really challenging and really entertaining discussion. I learned a whole load of new things that I didn't know existed, including homebrew medical devices. I seriously, I think it's been a fascinating discussion that's got implications and challenges not just for the NHS, but I can see all of those issues translating through into listening to students, to listening to staff in educational contexts, and that real need for psychological safety as being something which is so important for developing effective responses to the challenges that we face. So can we again thank Henrietta and Simon for a fascinating evening. And just as we leave, we do have a series of events across the calendar year. I would encourage you to keep in touch and find out about our next events. We do like to be right at the forefront of those challenging issues of the day that we're trying to grapple with. And as part of that, in our 60th anniversary, we have a series around reimagining the business schools. We've got to reimagine the health service, so we need to reimagine business schools and work more collectively and collaboratively on responses to the challenges that we face. So enjoy the rest of your evening and have a safe journey home. Thank you.